Our next speaker has been speaking at FITC events for over a decade and is thrilled to have him back in person. Please welcome to the stage, Bermon Painter.
Hey everybody, it's good to be here and see your faces again, not be in my house on a Zoom call. It's nice. So I have a confession to make that I want to share with you all today. So if you're here, lean forward just a little bit. If you're online, you can sort of come in closer to your screens. I don't enjoy programming as much as I used to, right? I just don't. Thank you for the one person, Kyle. I don't. The things that changed, and I know it's sad, super sad, to not enjoy the thing that you've been doing for 20 some odd years. But let's wipe away those tears. I'm going to explain what I mean a little bit on why I don't enjoy it as much. And we're going to go through what's been happening in the digital space with front-end development and what we typically do day to day. Now, to be fair, this is sort of through my perspective and how I sort of went through and learned the internet. So take it like that. The dates are a little bit wibbly-wobbly, so they're not factually correct, but that's what it felt like in my heart. So let's start with the 1900s. This is what it feels like when I talk about doing web stuff years ago. Not quite that far back. It's more like this, like the colorful pastel 90s with jam pants and things like that. Technology's made substantial progress over the past few decades. So I want to go through that really quickly, and then we're going to get into a bunch of composable content. So, the 1990s. This is kind of what it looked like, again, from Bermon's point of view. We were writing static HTML. Tables were really kind of the thing. CSS was there, sort of. Dreamweaver, I was a fireworks guy. Loved the program a ton. Thank you. It's still, near and dear to my heart. And then we fast forward to sort of the 2000s. This is where I feel like front end and the web really started to get a nice little foothold into what was going on. We had server-side includes. CSS was definitely more of a thing. We had semantics. There was this fancy thing called DHTML that eventually turned into Ajax. jQuery, we were talking about that in the green room upstairs. It's still like 70% of the internet, but it was a big thing then. I still love it. PHP, .NET, Ruby, all of those languages came out. Joomla, Drupal, WordPress. I did a lot of Joomla sites back in the day. Did a bit of Drupal, never really touched WordPress. Subversion, Mercurial, and Git were there for version control. SOAP was sort of the way that we communicated with things in whatever APIs were back then. SOAP was terrible. If you've ever had to use it, you understand. And then we go to sort of 2010s. CSS3 becomes much more commonplace. The working group's done a fantastic job making sure that all of the good things that we needed to do in CSS exist. We have preprocessors, Sass, less stylus. Node sort of starts to take over the world just a little bit. We have Backbone and Ember, a handful of other Angular, as we heard about earlier this morning. You get package managers. We're doing a lot of single-page apps now. Do a lot of static site generators. I personally love that space, played in that a ton. And REST becomes more of a common thing, which was way better than using SOAP. And then we sort of fast forward into the 2020s, which don't get me started on just the beginning of the 2020s, but we sort of start to go headless, we go serverless, we have decoupled front ends, we have build systems, we have design systems, and we start moving into more composable platforms. You have microservices. We talked about AI a bit this morning. That's going to become more of a common thing as we go into the next decade or so. Where I struggled is from a dev experience. It's become so complex. We're solving problems that are so large, and the JavaScript ecosystem is still fairly fragmented. If you look at common Angular, React, any JavaScript app that's using any package manager, there are hundreds and hundreds of packages that are typically included. It's fuzzy. It's difficult. I have a challenge with it. My teams have challenges with it, and they're way better programmers than I am. But things are changing and we have an opportunity. So what I see happening is, one, change is accelerating at a faster and faster pace. Data, there's just so much data. For anybody that works in the enterprise space, they have more data than they know what to do with. And then things are getting more and more complex. If you contrasted the types of websites and apps that we built 20 years ago to what we build today, it's night and day. We're trying to do so much more with the data and the devices to create these experiences, whether they're internal or consumer. It's just really complex. And what that means for us as front-end developers is if we really want to become exceptionally good at what's happening, we have to unlearn what we know. And for folks that have been doing this 10, 15, 20, 30 years, there's a lot of stuff in your heads, in our heads. Some of that just kind of needs to go away. I still appreciate hand coding sites, but I would never do that today for any client work. And then we have to loosen our hold on the past, right? Get exceptionally good to learn new things, because things are changing so quickly in the tools that we use, the types of devices we have access to, and the expectations that people have at the end of the day. So, you know, we got to learn a bunch of new things. That's what I'm really excited about. I love learning, and I love solving really big challenges. So that makes me happy. There we go. So that's just sort of the context of how I've sort of seen this space evolve over the past few decades. And that kind of leads us into what we call composable. So I want to talk about this for the next 20 minutes or so, just so you know kind of where I come from. So I work for a global consultancy called Slalom. I lead all things digital for the firm. And my teams have typically always been made up of researchers, designers, developers, to build end-to-end applications, typically in the enterprise public sector space, across a bunch of industries: healthcare, financial services, retail, mining, et cetera. We partner with anywhere from startups to Fortune 500 companies. And what that means is we get a chance to work on a whole bunch of just wild and crazy things all the time. There is constant change for every new project that we start to work on. And we also get a chance to work with teams that have varying levels of maturity. Some are extremely mature. They have consolidated APIs. They have a nice, robust design system. They have a nice end-to-end build system. They're doing all of the right things that they should do, all the way to teams that don't really know what HTML is, and they're using something that somebody hand-coded a couple of decades ago to try and run their enterprise. So we get a wide breadth of different experiences. So over the past 18 months, what we've started to see is a pretty substantial change or transition in how companies are trying to build their digital experiences. In the last 3 to 6 months, that's been accelerated a lot. Haven't quite put my finger on why, but we're seeing a lot of these types of requests come up from just about every client that we talk to. So to contrast, the way that I think about this is we have this shift in composable, shift to composable, and we have what we call the monolith, and then we have composable itself. So when I think about a monolith, these are basically single unified systems. Everything's managed in one big box. It's a monolithic architecture, right? So typically you have your user display, what the client typically renders. You're going to have your page templates. You're going to have a back end, your front end. You'll have your business logic baked in there as well. You're going to have all your content that sits in that system typically, and then you're going to have your database. That's how we built digital experiences for quite a while. Nothing wrong with it. We all did that quite a while. If you think of some of the most common CMSs and frameworks that are out there, you have like the Drupals, the WordPresses, if you like .NET and Braco on the open source side. On the enterprise side, you have things like Sitecore, Adobe Experience Manager. Even some of like Rails kind of falls into this space, and I love Rails, but we don't do a lot in that anymore. But that's kind of how it was set up originally. We've done a lot in that space collectively as a community. On the flip side, we have these emerging composable systems that are starting to come into view. And I'll blow that diagram up and we'll kind of walk through it when we talk about a real world scenario. But when I think about composable, the way that I would define this is you're breaking down all of those bits and pieces that would typically live in a monolith into these modular composable components that let companies select specifically what they want to combine, update, rip out, and replace, and they can do that independently. And that's the biggest shift that we're seeing. Now, for those of us that have worked with components from like a React or an Angular or a Vue standpoint, or we worked with design systems, it's a very similar concept, except you're doing that level of composability for everything, which gives teams a lot of flexibility. So if I were to break it down, it's sort of like another level. This is kind of how we see some of the pros and cons and how we decide what's going to be the best infrastructure and architecture to create for some of the clients that we partner with. You have sort of like these open source monoliths. Still love that space. We still do a fair amount of that work. They're typically open source platforms, right? They're flexible. There's great community support. They're cost effective, typically, right? They're open source. Maintenance is kind of a pain for some of the clients to have to use them. There's limited support, right? They don't have enterprise level SLAs or service level agreements most of the time. They can scale to a point within the purview of typically a single digital experience. You have the enterprise monoliths that are sort of the same. They're a bit more comprehensive in what they offer, right? They're enterprise. You get dedicated support, which is great. They're scalable to handle really big problems. They're expensive. They're not as flexible. And you're heavily dependent on that vendor to keep things up to date, which if any of you work in the enterprise space, things move a little bit slower than a startup or a smaller business. Now, when we think composable, right, this is where we're creating this foundation of flexible, scalable architectures. It allows us to integrate easily with other composable systems. When you think of things like analytics, e-commerce, payment platforms, personalization, content management systems, customer data platforms, there's a whole bunch of different things in that ecosystem that we can use and integrate with. They're all API driven, and that's what we typically like about it. That they feel you're either in REST or in GraphQL, and you can sort of pick and choose. They're flexible, they're scalable, you get a lot of control, which is what I like. One of the things that I really enjoy as a front-end developer is it allows us to decouple the front-end experience from the underlying systems, which is great because we can do a lot more in how we design and develop those experiences. It also helps us be more adaptable as we're creating those. You'll see that here in a second. Now, this isn't all-inclusive, but these are some of the ones that I care about. If you look across sort of the composable ecosystem, there's a bunch of buckets, and in each bucket, there's a bunch of different options. We're going to focus on a few of those today around the headless CMS, serverless platform, UI components, but there's other stuff in there. Okay, let's make it real. We've been working with this company for about 18 months now. This is what I call like a big T digital transformation. It's one of the largest automotive companies here in North America. They have 15 brands. They have multiple websites, multiple apps. They have digital kiosks because they have physical locations. And they have digital signage that show things like promotions and things like that. So it's a fairly complex ecosystem that they need to be able to support. And it's been a blast to try and figure out how do we help them both increase their maturity and also create these architectures that are composable that they can maintain, that can better serve their clients. Because at the end of the day, whatever we do as front-end developers, a human being has to interface with it somewhere down the line, whether it's internal or external. So here's what we have for them. The way that we start to define composable systems, it starts to look something kind of like this, where we have, for lack of a better phrase, we call them composable components. There are some that we consider to be core to just about any digital experience that we create. You have a headless CMS. Typically, we're interfacing with marketing communications teams and the CTO or the development engineering teams, or both, hopefully both in most cases. So the headless CMS is essentially, it's a content API. You get content modules and then you get the admin interface that the editors typically use to go in and change their content. And that's really all the headless CMS is. Then we typically add on things like e-commerce, authentication, or identity management, analytics. There are some really great platforms out there today. Add on things like search. And then we have additional components that we can add on as well. Some marketing teams prefer to have a much stronger visual editor, a la Dreamweaver, I think, where they can click and drag and kind of move things around and edit content that way. There are a handful of visual interfaces that make that easier. One is called StackBit. For those that are attending the workshop on Tuesday, you're going to get a nice end-to-end view into programmatically how do we configure Contentful and StackBit and Netlify and get all of those systems connected and talking to each other so that we can create front-end experiences. In our case, we're going to be using Next.js. But that's what we have, right? So we have these systems that we can kind of pick and choose. We feed those through what we call a centralized API layer. So all the APIs go to this central place. One of the reasons that we do that is if we decide that, you know, we don't like the identity management platform, we want to rip that out and plug in a new one, it doesn't have as many downstream impacts once it gets to the front end. Because once we go into the decoupled front end, we're interfacing with this centralized API layer. So things can happen behind that, and it doesn't really affect the front end as much. We're trying to reduce our risk there and make our lives easier as front end developers, right? Because we're essentially just consuming APIs and building the front end at that point. When we move forward into the front end, typically at a minimum, especially when we're talking multi-brand, and that was the case for this client, we're building a shared UI component library. We'll typically default to Storybook as our go-to, because it essentially gives us a component API that we can feed into multiple apps, websites, etc. And then all of that gets fed into typically one or more property gets fed into where we're going to host it. Typically, we'll use something like a Netlify, maybe a Vercel, to host those, because it typically has a Google or an AWS kind of behind the scenes. But then it gives us a lot of really good control over how do we optimize the front end, how do we optimize rendering, how do we interface with a content delivery network, so that whatever that payload is that the end consumer, the end user has to download, it's small, right? We don't want to send folks a 50 megabyte payload of content every time they refresh their browser. Keep it tiny. And then that allows us a lot of flexibility to support a bunch of different channels, but everything's coming from the same infrastructure. And from a content standpoint, all of the content's coming from a single source of truth. So in the case of this client, they have multiple websites, and they have multiple web apps, or native mobile apps. They also have the kiosks and the digital signage in each of the locations, and it's thousands of locations. It is unrealistic to try and build something custom for every single franchise, so we built this nice infrastructure that's taken us a good 12 months or so to build, so that they can then maintain it in the longer term. So let's break this down just a little bit more. So we think of Contentful. There are many of these. They're one of our preferred partners. We do a lot with them. It's really just a single source of truth for the content. There are a couple of things that are really important when you're using a headless CMS. One, it's similar to Drupal or WordPress in the editor experience. It's very different in how we integrate with the CMS from a front-end standpoint. Because the front end's decoupled, we've taken that out. We just get an API. So when we think of how do we begin to break down what we need to build from a front-end standpoint, what does it look like? So this is an example on page. I can't show you all the client stuff because I'll get in trouble. However, this is something really quick from our company page. We typically look at company pages, right? We look at the different pages and we break that down. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One, we do this so that we understand what types of data need to exist so that we can create our content models. That's what goes into the CMS. And then from a UI component standpoint, what do the UI components look like? What types of data, what types of structure do they have? And how do we look across everything and consolidate things down to have a smaller subset of reusable, configurable components, either from a UI or from a content standpoint. It's worth noting that it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's close-ish in some scenarios. And then what that allows us to do is we can create content models. Now, where a lot of engineering teams have a challenge is they just start shoving stuff into the headless CMS. And it's all form-based. You're not really programmatically writing out what the data models are. You're doing that through the interface. And that allows you to nest and build a relationship between one content model and another, and then combine those to create essentially your page templates that you would use to ingest from the API standpoint into the pages that you're building in whatever front-end framework it is. So if you don't take the time to define that well, two terrible things happen. One, your API is going to be impossible to ingest. It's going to be either nested too deeply or too brittle. And then two, the editor experience is going to be miserable because however you configure your components in the CMS affect both of those things directly. So there has to be some thought put into it. So that's why we spend some time in the beginning doing some of these mapping exercises. And then from a UI component standpoint, so typically we'll do the same thing, right? You have buttons, you have forms, you have a combination of all those things together, and we use those to create pages. In our case, we use React and Next a ton, and that's what allows us to start to build things out in whatever your preferred build system would be for a front-end standpoint. In their case, they needed a multi-brand component library. So if you've ever worked on a single site, there's a bunch of stuff, right? There are buttons, there are a bunch of variations of buttons, there are buttons combined with icons or form elements or other things. You have navigation, maybe there's a drop-down, maybe there isn't. You have other interactions that you need to build. Multiply that by 15 different brands that were built separately. How do you bring all of that in together so you don't have 15 variations of all of those different buttons? That would be an impossible task to maintain. So we combine all of those, and then we use design tokens as a mechanism to help us theme everything effectively. It takes care of our colors, our spacing, to make each brand start to feel unique. And then it ends up just being a button's a button, a header's a header, navigation's a navigation, and we can toggle off and on specific functionality. But it's one component sitting in one place that can be used as many times as we want across different brand sites or across different applications. Where that gets a little bit dicey is we try and put everything in a design system or everything in a component library. Everything doesn't have to go in the design system. Some things are specifically unique for a brand and it's a one-off, and that's okay. So trying to balance that is important for us as we work with our counterparts on the design side. So if you fast forward and think about serverless, sort of how that works. I've always thought that serverless felt like a misnomer because there are still servers out there, but that's what the industry called it. I'm not going to argue, it's what it is. We use a handful of different options. One of the things that we like about using some of these platforms, right? You think Netlify, you think Vercel, and there are a handful of others out there, is it's a really good dev experience for us because it integrates tightly with whatever version control system we're using, typically something Git-based, it's great. It integrates with our CI/CD pipelines. It makes managing that content easy. And then when we think about rendering pages, whether it's something like a Next or other front-end systems, we have a lot more control over what we render and how we render it. There's a lot of optimization and performance-related work that we can do to reduce the payload and increase the speed in which we're serving content to the end user. So it's really helpful. And then it's also great for marketers. One of the biggest complaints that we see or hear when we talk to people on the marketing and the communication side that aren't in technology is they have to rely on the development teams too much to do really basic changes. And it causes them a ton of grief. And when we talk to the development teams, they're tired of doing all of these different medial tasks that the marketing team asks for. And it's because the systems aren't set up in the way that gives the appropriate teams the appropriate freedom. So the other thing that we really enjoy about this is we give more power back to the folks that are editing and managing and changing and publishing content, and we're freeing up the engineering teams or the development teams to do work they actually want to do, solving bigger problems than, okay, I've got to change this template so somebody can publish this thing, or I have to publish this thing and it's got to go through the full QA cycle and it's going to take up a bunch of my time. So there are a lot of efficiencies and gains that we get across the board. Moving to better systems and building these systems to function for the experience of the person that needs to interact with it, right? Marketing systems for marketers, dev systems for developers, etc. So we're going to go full circle. We heard this a few times in the morning, and I think it's very much true, right? If we go back to our timeline, if you go from like the 90s to 2020, we started out server-side, and then we sort of started doing server-side and client-side, and then we spent the last decade mainly doing single-page apps and doing client-side apps. I think we realized that probably wasn't the best idea, but it was cool at the time, and now we're essentially moving back to server-side. Now, I'll caveat that. One of the benefits that we get with composability, because we're decoupling these monolithic systems and decoupling the front end, is we now have a lot more control over how we optimize the front end. And if we're using some of these modern serverless platforms, what that means is we can choose to render the pages as static sites and then just send the server HTML. Still love that. It's fast, it's efficient, it's secure. But we also have the option to render things on the server. Going back in time a little bit, but to the points that were made earlier, it's faster and it's more efficient to do all that processing on the server than it is on the client side, especially for highly interactive applications. But then we can also hyper-optimize. We can choose which pages or sections of an application or a website need to be static and need to be interactive. And we can mix and match as we need to get the highest level of performance. And then from a cloud standpoint, manage that cost a little bit because it requires a lot of processing power if we're rendering the site every single time somebody comes to a page. So what does that mean for us in the future? I personally don't think it's us sitting behind a computer and developing a button or forms or interfaces again for the 1000th time. That's not the best use of our time as developers. Now, we sure can do it. We can do it well. I've lost track how many custom forms that I've built and how many custom workflows that I've built. I just don't enjoy that part of it anymore because I've done it a lot. So it's moving forward a little bit where some of these menial tasks that we used to have to do are no longer complex or solve problems. And we saw, I think Wes this morning talked about some of the AI generators that can generate some of that for us. We can offload more of this to AI, which I think is where the industry is going to be going. And the way that we think about it as a team is AI is not the enemy. AI is something that enables us to be more efficient humans if it's framed and used in the right way. And that part of it I embrace. I'm looking forward to the day where I can just say, I need to build a page that has buttons and forms based off of this API, and it'll just sort of do it for me so I don't have to. That way I can focus on doing more complex things that maybe AI can't do, and I can focus on solving more complex challenges that have a downstream impact on the community or people. You care about the people, right? That's what is really important. The other thing that I think will be coming up is our relationship with designers. There are tools now that give designers more power to do development through an interface. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I don't feel like that's a threat. It's just the natural iteration of how things are shifting as an industry. What that turns into, not really sure, but I'm excited to find out. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I think we're going to shift into QA. Thank you for your time.
All right, that was excellent. Very much enjoyed that. Why don't you join me here? And I have a lot of thoughts about Composable. I used to work in Netlify. I have a lot of feelings about Composable.
Okay.
But I agreed with a lot of what you said, and you have done it at a scale that I think is very interesting to dig into. So as you were doing this, transition, what did you find were like the most unexpected challenges, and how did you navigate through them?
The two challenges I think come to mind. One is data. Data is always the issue. Like I said, a lot of companies have a lot of data. A lot of it's bad data. And if we're trying to, let's say in this case, right, we need a lot of rich customer data to be able to personalize some of these experiences. So as an example, right, this is one of their biggest challenges right now because they have a franchise model. If I go get my oil changed at one of their franchises, and then I go get my car washed, and then I have an accident and have collision repair, and then I need to get my auto glass replaced, like the front windshield replaced, I am 4 different people from a data standpoint for the company. What that means is I'm getting marketing emails and messages from 4 different companies, even though they're technically the same company. So their customer experience is lower than it could be. And a lot of that is because they have poor data, and they're not connecting their data across their different business units. And that happens a lot in a lot of big enterprises that have multiple products and multiple business units. So that's challenge number 1, right? Bad data, bad customer segmentation. We can't do a lot to make that experience better until the data is in a better spot. So we spend a fair amount of time trying to figure that out, helping them employ what we call a customer data platform that just consolidates all the customer data, makes it not terrible, and then lets us do some cleaner segmentation. The second challenge is it's still new-ish, like it's a new concept for a lot of people. And this is top to bottom, right? Our project managers, our designers, our engineers, our cloud architects, it's still a newer concept. That means that we're figuring things out as we go to do things at that scale, which means that there were some things that probably we would have done different, right, looking back. And we started to make those changes on some of the newer brands that are coming on board, which means we have to fix some of the old stuff. But I think that's sort of the natural evolution of how we solve problems, right? We iterate, we try and make things better over time. And then when we start the next project, we have a lot more learnings.
Gotcha. So I have a follow-up to that, which is,
please.
You know, you are rolling out something that is a fairly huge shift in the way that the teams in the company interact with both the component system, but also just like the tools in general. So as you were rolling out a composable architecture, what were the most significant challenges in getting the teams to adopt, or like the most significant learning curves, I guess?
That's a good question. One of the things that companies typically forget is how to manage the change. And that's both from an internal perspective for their employees that are using the systems and also for their customers. I'm not good at that. That's not my forte. But we have people that work in separate teams that love change management, and that's what they do. So that's the thing that we focus on a ton, is to bring on folks that live and breathe that space and can help us figure out the change that's going to happen. So, you know, in this case, a couple of examples. We're giving their marketing teams across all of their brands something new. They've never really had a CMS before as a company, which means they don't really have a ton of context. So we have to train them to think about how they market differently and train them how to use these systems. That means we have to teach them more about SEO and how the content they create impacts their search engine results. It also impacts the search on the site. We have to train them to a certain degree how to do some minor asset management and optimization. I'm sure some of you have probably seen this before, where somebody somewhere in a non-technical team has uploaded some stock photos that they got from a site, and it's like 30 megs. And every photo is 30 or 40 megs, and there isn't anything set up to optimize those. So now you have this massive payload in the API that you have to build into your pages. That was one challenge that we had to solve with them. Contentful solves a lot of that for us. Most of the headless CMSs do that nowadays. An interesting thing there that we've noticed as well, if you think of like the Contentfuls, even the Salesforces. Salesforce has something called Einstein. And they've been adapting that AI model for content marketers to help with imagery, words, metadata, page titles, and things like that I think is really interesting. And then the second challenge is patience, right? Internally, people want things now. If you ever work for a publicly traded company, they make decisions quarter to quarter, typically earnings call to earnings call. So if the stocks don't go up quarter to quarter, there's just this constant shuffling on budgets and what they're choosing to do and substantial shifts. And some of that's happened for sure, where things have started and had to get paused, but they were really important things that needed to be done to continue to give them a strong foundation. So at that level, those are things that we're constantly combating. Change, training, perception, the board in a lot of cases, to just make sure they understand why what we're doing is valuable and how it relates to the ROI at the end of the day.
Feel free to dodge this one if this isn't your space, but when you're trying to justify something like this, because this is the epitome of a project that is very hard to justify as a direct ROI.
That's right.
Right? Because I can justify it to other developers, I can justify it to engineering managers, I can maybe justify it to the sales team as like, hey, we'll be able to move faster. How are you justifying to like executive leadership that this is where we should be putting this many resources and this many hours?
Yeah, it's a hard question. We try and do that a few different ways. One, I think this is where designers and developers struggle a little bit, unless you've gone to like an MBA school. I haven't. I had to learn this kind of the hard way. The way that we speak to each other and the language that we use is not what business stakeholders and executives use. They might have read like an HBR article and can pick up on some buzzwords, but they don't really know what it means. What that means for us is we have to learn their language. They're not going to learn ours. So we have to be able to tell stories in a way that they're going to comprehend. So that's thing one. Otherwise, everything else is just impossible. The second thing that we do is we try and give them quick wins. It's really difficult to continue to do sort of like this nebulous, difficult to track thing behind the scenes. Because one of the things that we notice is executive level tenure is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you have like this big 2, 3, 4 year project that requires a bunch of different things to happen, but your CTO is, they're going to change hands every 2 to 3 years, you're never going to get through it. So we try and compress things down into at least 12-month windows or less. While we're doing those bigger things, we try and understand what are like the big rocks that they need to move now, and we try and see what we can do in much shorter time frames. Like the most important thing is so they get to tell a better story to the board. Or if there is no board and it's a private company, they see that you're driving value early and often, and you're not sort of like heads down and maybe in 12 months they'll see a return on the work. The third thing that we do is we have to help them sometimes tell that story. So I have a peer on my side, we call them our create team. They help us with visual storytelling. They'll do like executive level demos, presentations, videos. Like as an example, it's really difficult to help an executive that's not technical understand why do we need to spend 3 or 4 months building a foundational design system and doing what we'd call a discovery across all of these different sites. So what we came up with is it's like, how much does a button cost? and we'll do an inventory, like how many buttons do they have across all of their brand sites? How many variations of those buttons do they have? And then what does it typically cost a single developer from a time standpoint to develop a single button? So like you say, you know, on a good day, if we're building sort of like a medium complexity button, it takes a couple hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours. If we're getting stuff from the design, doing the dev, got to go through test, got to write the unit test, it's a few hours, right? If I'm a consultant and let's say I charge $100 an hour, it's $400. So it's $400 per button. And if you have 400 buttons, that's a massive, massive price tag.
Yes.
So we try and do things like that.
I like that. It's very useful. I think it's continually drilled into my head through the years that as you get more senior as an engineer, the engineering you're doing is human engineering. You're trying to figure out how to fit a problem into somebody else's head.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So a lot of the concepts that you're discussing here are fairly high level, fairly high complexity. How do you think teams and juniors especially should kind of train themselves up to adapt as we move from this idea of like, well, it's one file and it's one server to this, it's a whole bunch of tools and the different people use different parts of them and they all fit together in weird ways. Do you have any have you trained juniors to do this? What are the mental models that you're seeing work?
We do. I would say we do a lot of mentoring with some of our junior folks. And then I run events in Charlotte, so I get to talk to a lot of folks that have come out of code schools or university in like a CS degree, or they just sort of like this and they're trying to get into the space. The biggest challenge that I see newer folks have, even more senior folks, is there's a lot of choice. There's too much choice. So they don't really know where to start. And you know, we all have opinions. Some of those opinions are pretty darn strong. For junior folks, it's easier to just start somewhere. Like pick one. Pick a framework that you like. Pick a platform that you want to tinker with. I mean, all of these platforms, they give you free access. And just build something. You can, Kyle was over there somewhere. Kyle has a ton of really good training series, a video series that kind of walks people through end to end. There's a massive amount of stuff on YouTube, a whole bunch of other video sites. Just like choose a tutorial, go through end to end, so you understand how these things connect. The second challenge that we see a lot for folks that specifically haven't gone through like a CS program, and they come from a code school. Most of the code schools teach frameworks first. So you learn the framework, but you don't really learn the underlying coding concepts. So when folks get into much more challenging concepts that require a little bit more knowledge, they really have a really hard time. Not that code schools are bad. Like I love folks from code schools. Half my team have come from code schools, and they've learned a lot over the years. It is important to spend a little bit of time understanding. I think somebody earlier was talking about vanilla JavaScript. You need to learn sort of the basics of JavaScript if you're going to be in the front end space, because that's the foundation of a lot of what we do now. Learn semantics, learn more deeply about CSS and how those three things are connected. And that'll make things better over time. But start somewhere. Doesn't matter where it is. You just got to start somewhere, pick a thing, do the thing, make some stuff. And it'll change in a couple of years. You'll learn something new. So you unlearn it and learn something again.
Pick a thing and make some stuff
that
belongs
pick a
on
thing
pillow,
and make some stuff.
I think. All right, that is all the time we have right now. Thank you so much. Another round of applause. Thank you, Bermon.